This presentation today builds on work that's been done by others. So just to explain what I mean by e-learning in this particular presentation, what I'm going to focus on today is network digital technology. So I'm not concerning myself with standalone computers or CD-ROMs or DVDs. Some of you will be aware of the work of Basil Bernstein, the British sociologist, who started his research career as a sociolinguist looking at the sort of language patterns in working class and middle class children to try and unpack why it was that working class children were less successful in education than middle class children, and developed the idea of public and private language, which then morphed into the ideas of classification and framing. And that's the work that most people seem to be aware of. That's not the part of Bernstein's work that I'm going to talk about here. What I'm going to talk about is Bernstein refers to as the pedagogic device. When he moved to theorising the pedagogic device, he moved from a theorisation of what was being relayed, the language, to the nature of the relay itself, how that language was being constructed, maintained and legitimated. Bernstein describes the pedagogic device as establishing the grammar of pedagogic discourse, and referring to grammar in a metaphorical rather than a literary sense. There are three hierarchical rules that go to make up the way in which the pedagogic device works. First is the distribution rules, which distribute knowledge selectively to various groups so as to construct what is thinkable or unthinkable, what is legitimate knowledge or illegitimate knowledge in various groups. Second is the recontextualising rules establish the pedagogic discourse. And I'm not just referring to pedagogic discourse in the sense of language, I'm referring to pedagogic discourse in a broadly symbolic way, so as to include the ideas of language as well as myths and rituals and symbols and the way that timetables are structured and rooms are structured and so on and so forth. And in his broad sociological framework, he would not see pedagogic discourse as limited to education, but would also argue that, for example, in the relationship between a doctor and a patient, there is a pedagogic discourse going on. Following the recontextualising rules, there's the establishment of evaluation rules, and evaluation rules create the criteria through which what is deemed to be legitimate knowledge is established. And the one that I'm going to focus on is the notion of recontextualisation. And there are two aspects to the recontextualisation rules. One is what Bernstein refers to as official recontextualising rules, and the other is what he refers to as pedagogic recontextualising. He would argue that the balance in education between the influence of the official recontextualising field and the pedagogic recontextualising field ends up establishing what is seen as legitimate pedagogy. Now, I've gone through that really quickly, and what I shall try to do now is show you practical outcome of the pedagogic device idea. In my doctoral work, what I was interested in doing was looking at the dynamics that shape teachers' practice when they integrate online technologies into their teaching. One of the outcomes was this double football sort of idea, and I'm going to quickly walk through it. The outer circle is meant to represent the official recontextualising field. There are a number of factors that I was able to identify that really came out of the data rather than being forced into the Bernstein model, that they said, not surprisingly, influenced the way that they went about their practice. The nature of the curriculum, national, state, regional policy, organisational policy and the level of support, in some cases external agencies like nurses registration boards, and also the nature of the endorsed software. So in some cases, you're forced to use Blackboard. Blackboard has a certain set of assumptions that are pinned into it. The inner circle is meant to represent the pedagogic recontextualising field that Bernstein will talk about, but I've titled it teacher influences because it is only one part of the pedagogic recontextualising field. Other aspects would be the influence of things like people who write textbooks, people who write course materials that are online. In Bernstein's model, they're part of the pedagogic field. The little arrows here are an attempt to depict the dynamic going on here. This is not supposed to be a static model. And so there's a set of dynamic interactions going on between the official influences and the teacher influences. Some people have said to me, does that mean that over time, this line here, which is deliberately dotted, does that mean that where that is might go in and out depending on the level of influence that teachers are having. Certainly that wasn't my intention, but it seems like a reasonable way to think about it. In other words, if the official influence dominates the teacher influences, maybe I think about that line coming in, and if teachers are more autonomous, then you could possibly think about that line going out so that the official influences become a bit thinner. So, importantly in this model, what I proposed is that as a result of official influences, what gets legitimised is a certain pedagogic pool of possibilities. But what gets legitimised is a pedagogic pool, and that will vary depending on the particular circumstance. Now, in the vocational sector, there's no question that the pedagogic pool that's legitimised is consistent with competency-based training. And that at the end of the day, when teachers or trainers or instructors engage in practice, what they do is they select from the pedagogic pool a certain set of specific instructional practices. And those specific instructional practices are the sort of things that you see them doing. So they might be fond on discussions, they might be fond of problem-based learning, or they might be fond of lecturing, or they might, but they constitute the specific instructional practices. Now, with the exception of what I'll call radical teachers, who say to the official influences, well, I'm just going to do whatever I like, this is the model that operates. So for people that operate broadly within the official influences, they will select from the legitimised pedagogic pool. So my question then was, well, how does that happen? How do people make decisions about the way in which they select specific instructional practices? And what I proposed that teachers start in their teaching practice with a set of preferred teaching principles, and people will talk about values or belief or preferred pedagogic practices, but that these are a set of relatively stable, deep-held beliefs about what constitutes good teaching practice, and they're very difficult to change. By the time that students come to you at a tertiary level, these are established. Now, that creates a problem in this model because clearly teachers do change over time in terms of the specific instructional practices they use. Whilst I'm not going to talk about it today, I identified in the doctorate a number of variables in terms of use, application and integration of technologies in teachers' practice as a way in which preferred teaching principles acted to shape the way that teachers selected specific instructional practices from the pedagogic pool. And I don't have time to talk about them today. But I was still concerned that if the literature is correct and these preferred teaching principles are pretty set, then why is it that over a period of even a year or even really within a matter of weeks, people will change their specific instructional practices? So I put this, what I call the lens of disposition in here between the preferred principles and variables. And what I've argued is that these dispositions can change quite rapidly. So someone's disposition, for example, towards using SMS or to using discussion forums or bulletin boards can change very rapidly. If someone has a really good experience with that particular technology, people's minds can change very quickly and they'll start to integrate those technologies into their practice. If they have a bad experience with it, then equally so, the potential is, unless this disposition is very solid, that you'll end up with a more negative disposition, and so people are less inclined to use it. And so that, based on a fairly simple model of a feedback loop here, that effectively arguing that teachers select from a pedagogic pool their specific instructional practices, that they implement them, and then depending on the feedback that they get, that influences the disposition but doesn't really change preferred teaching principles, and so you end up with this feedback loop going on in here. So what for me, Bernstein's pedagogic device allowed me to do was to think that process through theorisation, but also to apply theory to practice.